So I'm going to do a brief introduction for each of our speakers today. So we have Chris Barton. Chris is the author of over 20 published books for young readers, including award-winning The Day-Glo Brothers, Whoosh, the Lonnie Johnson Super Soaking Stream of Inventions, which has been included in 21 state reading lists. His newest book, illustrated by Steffi Waltall, is Moving Forward, From Space Age Rides to Civil Rights Sit-ins with Airman Alton Yates. Just this past week, Moving Forward has been named to School Library Journal's list of the best books of 2022. Well, that is very exciting. And our next person, Jacksonville's Alton Yates, the subject of Chris's book, Moving Forward, is also here with us this afternoon. Yates is a veteran of the United States Air Force, where he participated as volunteer aerospace test subject during the early days of America's space program. After leaving the Air Force in 1959, Yates returned home to Jacksonville and became a civil rights leader. Yates has also worked in our community to support education, veteran services, and much more. And we are so honored to have you here today at the main library. And last but definitely not least, our interviewer, TiLena Robinson, worked as a middle and high school social studies teacher with Duval County Public Schools for 9 years before becoming a secondary social studies specialist with the district in 2015. She then transitioned into her current role as regional social studies specialist for high school in 2021 and continues to work with administrators, teachers, and students to carry out the vision and mission of Duval County Public Schools. She is also a member of DCPS's African American History Task Force, which brings equity, inclusion, and diversity to education by working with teachers to implement the teaching of Africa and its peoples and the contributions of African Americans into high school social studies. TiLena, I leave the rest to you.
All right, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our questions. So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Barton.
All right.
How did you learn about Alton Yates, and how did you come to write his story?
Well, as a lifelong Texan, I had never heard of Alton. I'd never heard of Axe Handle Saturday. I first learned about Alton in November 2016. I heard an episode from a couple of years earlier, I think, of the podcast StoryCorps. And this was about a 5-minute conversation between Alton and his daughter Toni, who's a TV reporter in New York City. And they were discussing Alton's involvement in this futuristic set of experiments at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico in the 1950s. I'd never heard of that base. I'd never heard of those experiments. I wanted to know more, and I picked up just enough as I was driving around listening to this, Alton's name, the name of the lieutenant colonel, the name of the Air Force Base, and that's when I began research. I wanted to know more about this man. And when I began learning more about him, I learned about his involvement in civil rights here in Jacksonville, and I learned about what led him from this military experience to the civil rights activism. And I reached out to see if he would be interested in talking with me for a book.
Okay, Mr. Yates, why did you agree to allow Mr. Barton to write your story?
I think for a couple of reasons. First, I wondered if anyone could ever be able to recapture some of the kind of activities that we had been engaged in back in the late 50s in New Mexico. There hadn't been anything written on it other than a story in 1959, I believe, in Ebony magazine. But I wondered if there was any way that records could be found that would talk about some of the kind of experiments we were conducting then. And somehow he was able to do things that, as far as research is concerned, that even the Veterans Administration couldn't do. So he was an amazing.
All right, Mr. Barton, what sort of research did you do for moving forward?
Well, before I came to Jacksonville in summer 2017. In fact, I did some of my research in this very room. There were documents and things I could not have found on the internet. I could not have found in databases. If I wanted to see those, I needed to come here to the Jacksonville Public Library. So it's a real thrill to be back here in this room. And I was able to see for myself some of the places where the events of Axe Handle Saturday and the sit-ins had occurred. I spoke with Alton before, but I was able to spend, my wife Jennifer and I spent an evening with Alton and his wife Gwen. The next summer, my then 14-year-old son and I made a road trip from our home in Austin, Texas to New Mexico. And so it's every 14-year-old summer vacation dream to go hang out in the archives of the library on the Holloman Air Force Base. And we also went to the nearby New Mexico Museum of Space History. And so there were lots of original artifacts there and test reports from the experiments. One interesting thing I found there, Alton, when I asked him about the aches and pains of those experiments, he was somewhat dismissive of how long they lasted, but I found documentation in those old documents of subjects, including Alton, at the time reported feeling those effects for weeks afterwards. And so that's an example of how you don't want to only talk to someone and get their memories. You want to try to document those and don't rely on only one source of information. And I was able to also put Alton in touch with one of his former colleagues, Bobby Teal, from that team in Holloman.
Yes. But you recall that I mentioned he was able to find things that the Veterans Administration couldn't find. When I started having some of the same kinds of aches and pains again later on that I had when I was in New Mexico, of course I went to the VA. The VA went to the base hospital at Holloman, and there were absolutely no records whatsoever. I don't know that there was anything left of the field laboratory that was at Holloman at that time. I don't. Did you find anything of the laboratory at the base?
I didn't see anything of the actual laboratory. I don't know that those operations remain there.
Yeah, I think most of that was gone. Some of the rocket sleds were relocated to the University of New Mexico, but the records that Chris found had been distributed to federal agencies throughout the country. Walter Reed Medical Center, for example, Lockheed, all of the contractors who had been involved in those studies out there and putting this equipment together and shooting us down the track, all of them had copies of the medical records that told the exact kind of pains and issues that we complained about. You would imagine, if you're going to be involved in experiments of that kind, there's a physical examination before your actual ride, and of course a physical examination after. There were no records whatsoever to be found until Chris found them.
Wow. That's interesting. So, Mr. Barton, how did you decide where to begin the story and where to end the story?
Well, I always try to do as much research as I can before I actually start writing the story, because I never want to settle on a narrative before I've gotten all the information. Eventually, I decided that the place to start was with Alton as a child talking to his next door neighbor who had been a World War I veteran. And I wanted to establish this sense of the continuity of history. Alton as a child next to someone who had gone to war in 1918, with a story continuing on up to the present day. So a reader who reads the story in 2022, especially someone who understands that the author of the book that they're reading is someone who has met Alton Yates, that connects them in a way to the story of this veteran who lived next door. So I wanted to establish that really long view of history, because the long view of history is important to this. It's important to understand that progress is not something that happens overnight. Progress may, if you look right up close at the events of the past few weeks or past few years, it may not look the way you want it to look, but if you pull back and look at generations, you can see how that progress has occurred. But I continued the story with a 57-year leap in time, right up to the present day, because I wanted to talk about how the story of Axe Handle Saturday and the bravery of the civil rights of the NAACP Youth Council here in Jacksonville, how that bravery continues to get recognized, how Jacksonville institutions in the past few years have come along to recognizing and say the failures of the local newspaper to report on the protests and on Axe Handle Saturday, and to finally put up the marker in what was then Hemming Plaza several years ago. So it was all the way from 1918 basically on up to the present day, because I wanted readers to understand that they are part of this longer history.
Okay, and Mr. Yates, I know that your story is actually shared in the book, but could you share with our viewers and our participants today your experience at Holloman Air Force Base and how that contrasts with your return trip back to Jacksonville, Florida?
Sure. At Holloman, I was a part of a small group of volunteers, and I emphasize the word volunteers. We were all volunteers to test the effects of space travel on the human body. Colonel John Paul Stapp, who was the director of that program, reached out across services, and he wanted to have people who would be interested in participating with him, because using anthropomorphic dummies and animals of all kinds. We use animals of all stripes on those sleds. After the run, an animal couldn't tell you where he felt the pain, what he was feeling. And Colonel Stapp was very safety conscious. In fact, a part of what he was doing was trying to develop safety mechanisms, not only for future space program. Remember, this is prior to NASA. This is in the late 50s. He was also developing safety mechanisms that we used in everyday life. For example, seat belts came out of that program. That was one of the big developments that we had. So in order to determine whether seat belts could actually save lives, he had to have someone sit in a vehicle, strap on a seat belt, and crash that vehicle into a barrier to see if the seat belt would hold the person in. And of course, he used the dummies at first. He used chimpanzees, but he still needed information. He wanted to know where the strap pinched. He wanted to know, what other sensations you felt as a result of the immediate stop. And we could tell him that. We could give him that information. It's important that I say here, Colonel Stapp did every one of the experiments that he had us do prior to our doing it. He was always first. He designed and developed these crude-looking machines and instruments, and he wanted to be sure they worked. Well, first he would test it on an artificial subject, but then he would be the next subject. And then after he did his ride, and of course, those of us who were volunteers continued. In addition to the seatbelt studies on the high-speed rocket sleds, we were able to determine whether or not a future astronaut could eject safely out of a high-altitude vehicle traveling thousands of miles an hour. Well, in order to do that, Colonel Stapp rode the sled at 632 miles an hour and stopped in 1 9/10 seconds to prove that those kinds of impacts and G-forces could actually be withstood by human beings. I rode rocket sleds by the time the Ebony magazine article was published in 1959. I had ridden more than 65 times. And I can't tell you how often I wondered where all of this was going. I mean, what would be the end result? And believe me, any and every time there was a launch of a rocket going to space, I think a part of me went with it. And it was working with that group of people in New Mexico was probably one of the most sensational and rewarding experiences of an entire lifetime. For 4.5 years, there was absolutely no racism, no prejudice. I mean, the thought of race never entered our minds. We were like a mini United Nations out there. We depended upon each other, and as a result of our being able to depend upon each other, we were extremely close. And we just, we were like family. And of course, it was shocking to me when I left the base coming home. The reason I had to come home was because I had received word that my father, who was widowed and who was trying to take care of my 6 siblings by himself, was in grave condition. He wasn't expected to live. And so I had to leave the Air Force to come home for that. I remember loading all of my little gear into my car, and I started that drive from Alamogordo, New Mexico, back to Jacksonville, Florida. And I want to think that I got about 150 or so miles out of New Mexico, and I went into this little gas station. I filled my car with gas, walked into the little restaurant that was attached to the station, and I sat down, and just as I sat down, 2 or more, I think it was 2 guys, there were a lot of folk in there, but there were 2 big guys who walked up behind me and grabbed me by the collar and used the N-word and said if I didn't get my black so-and-so out of there, I would regret ever having been in those parts, something of that nature. Well, I left, of course, and was glad to leave. As I drove along the way, I could find no place where I could stop and eat or use the restroom. It's a very uncomfortable trip. I found a grocery store, and I bought a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. And I ate peanut butter and bread all the way back to Jacksonville. I remember driving when I got to where US 90 crosses over into Mississippi. That's where I started seeing these billboards. There was one billboard that said, erected by Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and it used the N-word. It said, don't let the sun set on you in this county. And, that unnerved me a bit. I'm not going to say it frightened me, because I don't want you to know that I can be frightened too. But it unnerved me. And I decided that there were no rest areas during that time. Now you can pull off the highway and there's a rest area and you can feel comfortable. There was nothing like that. I had to use my restroom. The woods became my restroom. But I had to get home, and I was determined that once I got home and got my dad taken care of, I would do everything in my power to work as hard as I could to try to eliminate the kinds of conditions that I experienced along that highway. I was embarrassed, I was ashamed. To say the least, I was shocked. I was in my wife hates to hear me say this, I was in my beautiful blue Air Force uniform. I didn't think anybody, would do anything to an airman driving home. But that was my journey home, and I decided that if I could work as hard as I did to try to get a man into space, I was going to work as hard as I could so that man could live freely on Earth.
Right. So I know that with that experience, you went through emotions such as anger, but did your patriotism ever waver?
Oh, absolutely not. From the day I set foot at Holloman Air Force Base, I felt then, as I do now, that we live in the greatest country on the face of this earth, that we still have the opportunity to do just about anything we want to do. We've come a long way since the 1950s and 60s. We still have a long way to go, but at least in this country, you get an opportunity to work toward the achievement of whatever those goals might be. But no, my patriotism never wavered, and in fact, I was an enlisted man. I was two-striper when I was doing those works. I wound up retiring as a lieutenant colonel and putting in a total of 32 years of military service. So patriotism, wavering, absolutely not. And I encourage as many young people as I can to explore the possibility of a career in the military. It was most rewarding for me, and I just feel for some it would be a rewarding experience also.
All right, thank you for that. Mr. Barton, given recent developments in Florida's laws and schools, is 2022 an especially good time or especially bad time for moving forward to be published?
I think it depends on how people like the people in this room respond to this book and how librarians and educators respond to this book. If they are timid and afraid that anything about civil rights is too hot to touch right now, then people who don't want us talking about civil rights, then they've won. But if people are willing to, say, follow in the footsteps of the NAACP Youth Council, these kids as young as 13 years old in 1960, and show that courage and show that bravery in the face of people who want to intimidate them, then this is the ideal time for moving forward to come out. Now, there's a piece of history that I managed to not be able to fit into the book. I even tried to fit it into the little bitty type in the timeline at the back of the book, and there still wasn't room. About a month and a half after Axe Handle Saturday, one day in October of 1960, on the same day, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, the Democratic and Republican candidates for president, on the same day, they both gave speeches in Hemming Park. Neither one of them so much as mentioned the protests or the violence. Neither one of them, to me, showed the same courage that those kids as young as 13 showed. I think we can be more like the members of the Youth Council and less like these politicians.
So, Mr. Yates, serviceman, social activist, civil servant are just a few of the roles, of many roles that you have served in your lifetime. But of those three roles, which do you feel that you've had the most impact?
I wish you had added the fourth one.
What's the fourth one?
Husband. I think that's the one probably where I've had the greatest impact. God, when I think the fact that my grandchildren came from, that's crazy. I don't know. I think the civil rights movement was probably the one where we had the greatest impact, and the reason for that, the NAACP Youth Council at that time was led by a 16-year-old young fellow, Rodney Hurst, and our advisor was a public school teacher, Rutledge Pearson. Now, think about it. Public school teacher, a teenager, the movement was church-related in the sense that everything we did started with prayer, but the end result was that as a result of the sit-in movement here in Jacksonville, the barriers of discrimination started to come down. The walls of discrimination started to fall. And I think that was probably the greatest contribution of all that we did.
Did your civil activism continue after Axe Handle Saturday?
Yes, it did for a while. It continued until I was employed by the U.S. Postal Service. I was newly married. I don't know whether I mentioned, the weekend after I was married was Axe Handle Saturday. I can't tell you how Gwen felt, what she felt, but let's see. I stayed involved until, I think it was about a year and a half, 2 years after, and then when I was employed by the post office, one of the first things they read to me was something called the Hatch Act. And as a result of that, I could no longer participate in demonstrations.
Okay. I have my other questions here. So, what would you like young readers to take from your life story and apply to their lives?
The fact that they can be anything they dream of becoming, that there's a whole world of opportunities open to them out there, that there are opportunities for activism, of course. There are numerous opportunities for them to, enrich their lives by reading. And as a result of what they will encounter in some of the numerous beautiful books that are on the market, I'm certain that they will keep moving forward. I like that.
Mr. Barton, how did you get involved in writing children's books?
Well, I'd enjoyed writing ever since I was in elementary school, and I feel very fortunate in that regard. Some terrific authors don't realize until they are nearly out of high school or even beyond that they like reading, much less writing. So I felt fortunate that I figured out when I was very young I liked writing. I did not know what type of writing I wanted to do, maybe newspapers, maybe magazines, maybe writing for websites. I did some of all that in high school and college and shortly after. But when I was 29 years old, I was the father of a toddler. And if any of you have experience with a toddler, if there's something that they like a little bit, they tend to like that thing a lot and want it over and over and over. That repetition is how their brains develop. That's how they learn. Well, when my son was nearly 2, he insisted over and over and over that I tell him the fascinating story of how I installed a smoke alarm in our house. Doesn't that sound exciting? Daddy goes up the ladder, Daddy comes down the ladder, Daddy uses a drill, Daddy tests the smoke alarm, beep, over and over and over. He insisted I tell him that same story. And because I tried to be a good dad, I did tell him that story over and over. But one morning, as I was getting dressed for work, I had 3 epiphanies in 15 seconds. First, if I were to write that story down, somebody else could tell him that story for a change. 2, if he liked that story so much, maybe I could make up other stories like it and write those down. And 3, if he liked those other stories, maybe other kids would like them too. I did not know how to become a children's book author, but I knew that there were children's book authors, and if I just went into research mode, I could figure out how to do it. 8.5 short years later, my first book was published.
All right, that's wonderful. How do you decide on the topics for your books?
It generally is the ideas that won't leave me alone. And that first book of mine that was published, it was called The Day-Glo Brothers, a true story of Bob and Joe Switzer's bright ideas and brand new colors. That's a great example because I had first learned about the invention of those Day-Glo colors, those super bright oranges and yellows and pinks and greens that are so bright they glow in ordinary daylight. I'd learned about the invention of those colors years before I had that epiphany with the smoke alarm. Mm-hmm. But that story stuck with me. And I've learned that those stories stick with you for a reason. There's some reason why your brain won't let go of them, and it's a good thing because you may well end up spending, usually it's 4.5 to 5 years for one of these books to get made from the day I start actively working on it. So you better have an idea that appeals to you for a long time. And Alton's story was definitely one of those. Once I learned about his experiences as a Holloman, and once I learned about the other facets of his life, could not stop thinking about it.
Okay. What are the highlights and setbacks that you've experienced as a writer?
As a writer, well, I once had there was a biography for young adults had gotten a book contract to write, and I was so excited to do it. I got to spend a week researching at the Library of Congress, which was a thrill for me, and then at the beginning of one year, my editor for that book got laid off, and nobody else at her publishing company wanted to do that book. Because I was very into it, she was very into it, nobody else was into it at all. The year goes on, she gets hired by a different publisher, she's in the process of bringing my contract over from one publisher to the next, and the other publisher lays her off, and that was the end of that project. But that's, these things happen, and I have far more great experiences, especially the community that comes from children's writing. That was one of the very first things I learned the first day that I went into research mode to find out how to become a children's author. I learned that there were organizations, and I learned that there were people I could learn from. And I could think all the way back to elementary school, and how even back then, teaming up with friends to make a comic strip together, or write a skit together, even just have a friend of mine be the first person to read a story that I wrote. That sense of community was vitally important to my love of writing when I was a kid, and it's all the way through middle school and high school and college, all the way up to today, that sense of community is still extremely important to me. So having that community, whatever setbacks or mishaps come along, that community makes it much easier to deal with.
Okay. Do you have a preference in terms of, are you more partial to writing fiction versus nonfiction?
I tend to go back and forth between those. I love when I'm writing nonfiction, I wish I had the freedom to just make stuff up. And when I'm writing fiction, trying to invent a story, I wish I had this set of facts that I could just draw from. But all the way back to when I was a kid, I loved reading and writing both seriously researched stories and completely ridiculous stories. So I guess my preference is whatever someone is willing to publish.
And one final question. What advice would you offer to young aspiring writers?
So the 3 pieces of advice I would offer. One, I've already touched on, is that writing community. Even if it's just one other person with whom you can create a story together, even if it's just one other person that you look forward to sharing your story with. Nothing has ever motivated me more to finish writing something and to make that piece as good as I can as knowing that there's at least one person looking forward to reading it. In my case, I'm married to another author, my wife Jennifer Ziegler here on the front row. I want to, if I'm writing something funny, I want to make her laugh. If it's something sad, I want to make her cry. So I recommend finding or forming that writing community, even if it's just one other person. I recommend trying to always have something with you to write your ideas down. There's nothing more frustrating to me than remembering that I have an idea but not being able to remember what that idea actually is. So I try to always have something I can capture my ideas on. And the third is go out for walks, go out for runs, go get exercise, leave your earbuds at home. That's the hardest thing for me even today. That's a great way for me to get story ideas or to come up with storytelling solutions. If I'm stuck figuring out where a story needs to go, if I go for a long walk or go for a long run and let my mind wander, I will come up with a solution or an idea. It may not be the solution or an idea that I end up writing a book, but often it will lead to the idea or the solution that I need. So exercise and write those ideas down and find or form that writing community.
All right, thank you. And one final question for you, Mr. Yates. What's the next chapter in terms of your story?
The next chapter?
Yes, sir.
I guess I would like to continue being as active as I possibly can and looking for challenging opportunities to be engaged. I love reading to children, and I could spend a lifetime doing that if necessary, but I'm a yard man. I enjoy working around the house. I'm fully retired. Oh, I say fully retired. I'm about as retired as folk will allow me to be. But I just want to stay active for as long as I can and continue doing the things that I enjoy for as long as I possibly can. I think that's my next chapter.
All right, that's wonderful. All right, we're ready for questions for the audience.
Like I said, I don't have a question, but I wanted to add one thing to it. During the time he was doing this work, we were dating. And what he didn't tell you that was the things that he was doing, a lot of things he was doing was it wasn't shared with everybody. You couldn't tell your girlfriend what you were doing. And so one Saturday morning, I went to the drugstore and I was looking for something there, and I saw this magazine, but I wasn't interested in anything, really interested in thinking he was on it. I saw.
It was Sidney Poitier.
Yes. And it was talking about this Negro, actor and his wife, and so I thought, wow. So I started looking through the magazine to see, about Sidney Poitier, and then I saw this Alton Yates, and I couldn't believe it. I started thinking, well, there can't be that many Alton Yates, and I started looking at and I had no idea that he was doing this kind of thing. So I had to buy that magazine, but it didn't have quite enough money. So I walked back home and got my grandparents to give me money and went back and got the magazine and got a couple of them. And my family was so impressed that I was dating this wonderful guy who thought so much of his country. that he would risk his life 65 times for science. But another thing he did, he wrote me when he was in the military. He wrote me every day, and so while he was doing these experiments, he had written a stack of letters and given them to a friend of his, and told him to mail them. Every day you mail her another. I didn't find that out until he came home. The word I was looking for, the work that he was doing then was classified, so he couldn't share a lot of the things with me. But the other thing that is special in our lives is we got married on his birthday. And so I've never forgotten his birthday. And he's never forgotten my anniversary.
So the first question is for Mr. Yates. What was your first job after returning to Jacksonville?
My first job was, there was a company over on Tolerant Avenue. It was called Blue Diamond Mortar Company, and they provided building materials for the housing construction industry. I got a job driving a truck for Blue Diamond, and then about a year later, Blue Diamond led us to our first home. But at any rate, about a year later, Genuine Parts Company advertised a driving position that paid 15 cents an hour more than what Blue Diamond was paying, and so I went to work for Virginia Wood Park, and that's the way I began to move out.
Okay, what has been your favorite job in your career?
I think being the director of the Regulatory and Environmental Services Department for the City of Jacksonville was, well, maybe it's a toss-up between that and being the director of the Jacksonville Community Relations Commission. Well, no. No, that's not. All of my jobs have been really wonderful. But I think being the director of the anti-poverty program, Greater Jacksonville Economic Opportunity, was the most rewarding and fulfilling position I've ever held.
Okay, and it was rewarding in what way?
In that we were providing services for people to help them work their way out of poverty. Job training, for the young people, we had the Neighborhood Youth Corps. The Head Start program was one of the programs that we operated, and that provided early education for children. It was just an absolutely rewarding program. We used to say, from the cradle to the grave, we have something that's going to make your life worthwhile. That was rewarding.
All right. And this question is for you, Mr. Barton. How important is the relationship between an author and an illustrator?
The relationship between an author and an illustrator, I mean, there are kind of two relationships. One is a relationship of our work in the finished book. You know, in the case of Moving Forward, my text and Steffi Walthal's images have to work together seamlessly. And so usually the author writes a text, the illustrator creates the art, and then almost always there are some adjustments I make to the text to better fit, you know, here and there what's in the art. People are often surprised, though, to find that authors and illustrators of picture books typically do not work closely together. I've never met Steffi Walthall. I've never even spoken with her on the phone. Ordinarily, you know, the author is we kind of work separately, and I think generally it's a kind of a long-standing tradition in children's publishing. I think it's to protect illustrators from authors who don't have a proper sense of boundaries, to protect illustrators from authors saying, you know, make this guy tall, make that short, that should be red, that should be blue. Illustrators would not enjoy that any more than authors would enjoy an illustrator looking over our shoulders telling us, no, start a new paragraph there, no, use a different word for that there. So whenever someone is selected to illustrate a story that I've written, it's never my choice, but I will reach out to them as I did to Steffi. I said, first off, congratulations, I'm so glad we're doing this book together, because it's not my book that she's illustrating. At that point, it is our book. So number one, congratulations. Number two, if there's anything you need from me, let me know, and I'll provide all access to as much of my research as I can. And third, aside from that, I'm going to stay the heck out of your way, because she has to have the freedom to create her art. And if she were just illustrating what I had in mind, it wouldn't be the same book. She came up with this idea at the moment that Alton is struck on the back of the head on the axe handle Saturday. She had the idea for this spread that was going to take away from two of the pages at the back of the book that I was going to fill with details like the thing about the day when Kennedy and Nixon gave their speeches. I trusted her creative instinct. I trusted my editor's creative instinct to do that. And I'm so glad that we did that. So trust is the absolute most important ingredient.
Okay.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yes, sir.
What I couldn't understand was how she was able to get the house where I live in perfect position with the house where Mr. Jeffcoat lived, who was next door. And the way I used to talk with him was across the banister, and she got it. She wasn't there, but she got it, and he didn't know.
I gave her everything I learned, and she did the rest.
Wow, but that I thought was awesome.
And the comment, in addition to the question, is that the illustration are amazing in this book. So
They are
She
indeed.
did do a wonderful job.
And I believe that was Stephanie Walthall's first picture book.
All right, so Mr. Yates, and I think you've touched on this already. The question is, did you return to the military after your father's illness?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Did you return to the military after your father's illness?
After my father passed, I went into the Air Force Reserve. I went into active reserve, and I spent about 10 years there, and then I joined the Florida Air National Guard, and I retired from the Florida Air National Guard with a combination of my active duty service at Holloman and the Air Force Reserve and the National Guard. I had 32 years of military service.
So, Mr. Barton, how do individuals purchase your book?
I always recommend people shop at their local independent booksellers if you can go one. And really any bookstore, if they don't have the book there on their shelves, you can order it from. They can order it for you. But really any place that sells books, whether it's online or a physical bookstore, they can order it. They can get it there. Aside from always recommending people support their local merchants, I don't have a preference for where people buy it.
Okay. And this question is for you, Mr. Yates. The book actually touches on this, but I do want you to share with the audience members. How were you selected for the testing program since this was during segregation?
There were two different programs going on during that time. The organization that became NASA was conducting programs, I think up in Maryland, someplace like that. You probably saw the movie Hidden Figures.
Yes.
They were doing their research in a civilian-run organization. And I want to think 1950 to 1952, President Truman outlawed segregation and discrimination in the military. We were on the Air Force side. There was absolutely no discrimination whatsoever. And it was fairly easy for me to work in an environment that was totally free from prejudice and discrimination, because when you considered all of the volunteers who were there, I mentioned it was like a mini United Nation. Mm-hmm. It was Black, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Italian, German American, and we just sort of became family. I mean, led by Colonel John Paul Stapp, who was the son of a missionary, and a guy whom, when you look at him, you would think that, you wouldn't think that he would be someone who would do all the incredible things that he did. But he set the tone, and there was we never had a problem on that base.
All right. I believe this question may be for you, Mr. Yates. How do you feel about the fact that the country, especially Florida, is going backward in race relations, voting rights, the failure to remove Confederate monuments, and book burning? Or book banning, excuse me.
Well, the book is entitled Moving Forward. Unfortunately, there are some locations in our country, in our city, where we seem intent on moving backward. It's hard for me to understand that. I mean, I don't understand the rationale of a people who, when you look at conditions throughout the world, and when you look at the challenges that we have as a country, with those who are arrayed against us, who would love to see democracy fail, we seem to be trying to help them usher in the destruction of our democratic way of life. I don't understand it, and I'm certainly hopeful that enough fair-minded people will reach the point where they're saying, not going to happen. We're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to allow you to return us to those kinds of conditions.
Right. All righty. I'm going to start with question 2. Is racism the foundation of American society? Are we bound by its effects in the future? And I believe either Mr. Yates or Mr. Barton should respond to this question.
Are we bound by its effects in the future? I mean, I think it's a human quality, but certainly not one of our better human qualities, and I think we can overcome that quality. But I also think there are people who are willing to exploit that human weakness to satisfy their own personal power, and we need to continue pushing against that impulse and sharing better information about our history, about what we have overcome in the past, so that we can be better equipped to overcome this.
Yes, sir. Mr. Yates?
I'm an eternal optimist. When I talk to young people in youth leadership jacks and classrooms, and I believe we are developing a generation of young people who are simply not going to be able to accept those kind of conditions. I don't believe they're going to allow us to continue to drift backward. We have some of the sharpest, brightest young people I have ever seen. You know, I often say to myself, if you were as smart as some of these kids are today, there's no telling you where you might be, but we have some of the brightest young people this world has ever produced. And I think they're going to latch on to what we call our democratic way of life, this freedom that we enjoy, and they're not going to let anyone take us back.
Yes. All right, for Mr. Yates, were you scared when you were fighting for civil rights, and how did you overcome that fear?
No, I wasn't afraid. There's always some fear of the unknown, but you keep moving forward. And that's what I've always done. I've always simply marched on in the face of whatever challenges there were. The only way you're going to know whether you can overcome is by getting involved. And once you get involved, there's just no turning back. But no, I'm not fear.
And I just want to point out that on Axe Handle Saturday, the members of the Youth Council were aware of the white mob handing out axe handles. They were aware of what they were up against, and yet you all voted unanimously to go forward with your protest.
Yeah.
That's not the action of a scared group of people.
Keep in mind, these were 12, 13, 14-year-old kids. And when we went back to the church where they were gathered and told them that there were white men passing out axe handles at Hemming Park, and there was a good likelihood that we would be attacked, we gave them an opportunity to, forget about that demonstration. We asked them to raise their hands if they wanted to march, and for those who didn't, we would have their parents come and pick them up. Every kid in that church raised his hand. Every one of them. And every one of them marched out of that truck toward the dangers, the unknown dangers that they were going to face. We, all of our marches started with our singing the song, "We Shall Overcome." And I think we all felt that we would overcome. I mean, we did what we felt had to be done.
Mr. Barton, how long did it take you to write and publish moving forward?
This one was from the day I learned of his story, which was I think mid-November of 2016. It was published in the middle of this past January, so about 5 years and 3 months, which is just slightly longer than average. Usually from the time I start actively working on something till it's finished, 4.5 to 5 years. Wow. And that adds in the research time and time to find a publisher to say yes and to find the right illustrator. Publishers are dealing with supply chain issues, but yeah, it's no matter how much I want things to get published more quickly, it doesn't necessarily happen. So yeah, in this case, 5 years and 3 months.
Okay, and what inspired you to write this book?
I wanted to capture the fact, as I learned more about the story, not just the Holloman story, but the Jacksonville story and the driving between Holloman and Jacksonville story, I wanted to capture this idea that you can have these great advances in science and technology occurring at the same time as the persistence of some ugly, backwards social attitudes. That was true in 1959 and 1960. It's been true in the 6 years since I began working on this book. But the fact that some of those old attitudes persist does not prevent us from continuing to make these great leaps forward and continuing to make this progress. And I wanted to be able to pull back and show that longer-term perspective. The people who gathered and handed out axe handles in August 1960, they didn't win. Sometimes you have to pull back, but it was 40 years before Jacksonville really acknowledged the sacrifice of the Youth Council.
Right.
Sometimes you have to pull back for that perspective, and I couldn't think of anybody better than Alton Yates to provide that perspective.
Okay. And Mr. Yates, as part of your next chapter, does being active in social issues, do you see that being a part of your next chapter?
To the extent that I can, yes, that will always be a part of my life, I believe.
That's wonderful. And, all right. So, Mr. Barton, what was the most surprising fact you learned while writing this book?
The most surprising fact I learned while writing this book, that I'd never heard of it, that I'd never heard of any of these things. This was all new to me. I love writing about things I don't know anything about. I didn't know anything about Day-Glo colors, about how they worked or how they were invented. When I started working on that, I didn't know anything about the Nutcracker when I began writing a book about how that became a holiday tradition. I didn't know anything about this. It was all new to me. It's one of the things I love so much about making these books is I learned so much along the way. I have so many questions that I get answered. What was happening at Holloman was a revelation to me. What happened here was completely new to me. I do think that the fact that that one coincidence of the two presidential speeches just 6 weeks later, and no one acknowledged the protests and the violence, that to me spoke to the urgency of respecting, representing, and bringing forth that story that had been overlooked then and could have been overlooked now.
Okay. And Mr. Yates, tell us more about the neighbor who went to World War I. What are the things he taught you?
He was Mr. Purcell Jeffcoat, one of the most interesting people. I guess I must have been, maybe 8 or 9 years old when I talked to him. One of the most interesting people you could ever want to meet. And he talk to me about the promises that had been made to black men to get them to sign up to serve in the Army. He said that they were told that once their service was over, they would be given houses, they would be afforded an opportunity for an education, they would not have to worry about going back to those dreaded conditions that many of them came from. In fact, probably a majority of them came straight out of poverty and into the Army. Well, he couldn't understand why the government of the United States would not live up to its promise. When he completed his service, he came back to the same neighborhood, the same house he lived in when he enlisted. And it was, he obviously expected more. He expected at least that they would provide him with an opportunity for a job. He was unemployed, hadn't been able to get employment after he left the military. And getting jobs during those days were, unless you worked for the pulp mill, turpentine industry, it was hard to find a job anywhere. But Mr. Jeffcoat led me to believe that perhaps next time things would be different, and that I should not give up on the military. My dad wouldn't, he wouldn't hear of me giving up on the military anyway, because he was a Navy man. He did not serve in the military, but he worked at the Naval Air Station, and he wanted his 4 boys to experience military. Well, listening to Mr. Jeffcoat's stories, and then hearing the stories of those who served in the Korean War, they were the same. The guys came back from Korea with the expectation that there would be opportunities for employment, for housing, for benefit. Now keep in mind, those opportunities were provided to whites who came back from the military. They built communities. One that I remember, if I'm not mistaken, was Levittown in Pennsylvania. This was a community that was built for returning veterans. But there was nothing like that for people of color. And when I had a wonderful conversation with the person who really inspired me to go into the Air Force. His name was Daniel Chappie James. Daniel James had a brother whose name was Charles Chappie James, and Chappie was our coach at A.L. Lewis Junior High School. He invited his brother Daniel, who was a captain or a major at that time in the Air Force, to come and address the class. But he walked out on that stage. He was a Tuskegee Airman, a fantastic fighter pilot. He walked out on the stage of that high school and he announced in his booming baritone voice, "I am an American warrior." And when he did, that sold me on an organization that I hadn't heard that much about. Jacksonville's a Navy town. All you see was Navy. Every now and then you'd see a brown uniform, somebody from Camp Landing, but Jacksonville was a Navy town, and my dad had a Navy mindset. I went home that evening and I told him that I had met this major, was in the Air Force, and I am going to join the United States Air Force. I wound up in the Air Force. Second best decision I ever made.
I'm assuming that first best decision would be marrying Miss Yates. All right, that brings us to the end of our Q&A session. Mr. Barton, Mr. Yates, thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to sit with you and talk with you during today's Lit Chat. Your story is such an inspiration. And I commend you for writing the story, and thank you, Mr. Yates, for sharing that story with us for generations to come.
Well, thank you.